It's not dumbly there, it's intelligently there. Then we recall the biblical verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And through that Word, all things came to be. You see what that's implying? That the whole universe has been spoken into being by an intelligent subject. Science itself, and I'll come back to this, science itself is deeply congruent with this religious intuition. That the universe has been thought or spoken into being by a great intelligence. God is ipsum esse, being itself, through which the contingent universe exists. God is that great intelligence through which the intelligibility of the world comes to be. Those are approaches I've used a lot with my YouTube interlocutors. Flying spaghetti monster, we're not talking about that. Invisible friends, sky fairies, that's not what we mean by God at all. When you're willing to talk, I say to my interlocutors, more seriously about God, then we'll engage the question. Okay? Second heresy has to do with the Bible, with biblical interpretation. I find this is a huge stumbling block for lots of people. I'll state it bluntly this way. Many of my YouTube interlocutors think that Catholics approach the Bible the way a Muslim might approach the Quran. A Muslim will say the Quran was dictated by the angel to Muhammad. It's the direct word of God, dictated word for word. Catholics don't hold that. In the language of Vatican II, we say the Bible is the word of God, yes indeed, but in the words of men. It's a very important phrase, I find. The Bible is the word of God, yes, but in the words of men. That means conditioned by time and history and culture, and therefore always in need of interpretation. Precisely because it comes through this human vehicle, it always needs interpretation. You know, one of the great gifts to my YouTube ministry was Bill Maher's awful movie called Religulous. Did you remember that a couple years ago? Bill Maher, the comedian who hates religion, he's on Larry King constantly. Larry King loves him. He's always on. And he's always saying the silliest things about religion. Well, he did this movie that he was designed to make fun of religion. And his main tack was to take people who weren't, frankly, very bright and weren't able to defend their faith very well, and to bring before them all these scenes from the Bible that seem silly. So the talking snake, and so Jonah in the belly of the fish. Do you really believe that? And these poor people were sort of stuck in a corner. Vatican II says, one of the most important moves we can make in biblical interpretation is to be sensitive to genre. What kind of text are we dealing with? I argued now in response to Bill Maher's movie, don't think of the Bible simply as a book, although it is a book in one sense, because it's authored by God ultimately. It's for God's purposes. So it is a book in one sense. But in the human sense, the Bible isn't a book. The Bible is a library. It's a collection of books from a wide variety of genre, addressed to a wide variety of different audiences, written by different authors at different times. Therefore, see, the question, would you ever say to someone, do you take the library literally? Well, it depends on what section you're in, doesn't it? If you're in the history section, or you're in a section of journalism or political commentary or something, you might take it more or less straightforwardly. But now you wander into the literature section, the fiction section, the poetry section. You're not going to use the same clunky pair of lenses to read every book in the Bible. Do you read A Tale of Two Cities the same way you read the newspaper? Do you read a book of history the same way you read a poem? Well, of course not. You have to know what kind of text you're dealing with. So, this library of the Bible is made up of, I'll give you just a few examples. Those opening chapters of Genesis, I call them religious saga. The Song of Songs, I'd call a love poem. 1st and 2nd Samuel, I'd call theologically informed history. Paul to the Romans, I'd call a letter. Daniel, I'd call an apocalypse, etc. all different literary types, and all in need, therefore, of different styles of interpretation. My critics on YouTube always want to approach the Bible in a fundamentalist spirit. It's all journalism. It should all be read, therefore, with the same set of literalistic lenses. Won't work. And the Catholic Church, see, though, we've been very bad, I think, at propagating this to the wider culture. The Catholic Church has a very subtle, very intellectually sophisticated tradition of reading the Bible. Now, some of my critics say, oh, you're saying that now in the year 2010, but up until the present day, the church has been literalistic. Go all the way back to Origen, who was writing at the end of the 2nd, beginning in the 3rd century. Go back to St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century. Go back to St. Bernard in the 12th century, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. You're going to find very subtle, complex, symbolic, spiritual, and allegorical readings of the Bible. Fundamentalism is not the Catholic tradition, but rather a deeply sensitive, intellectually sophisticated, interpretive approach. We need to get that out. We need to remind ourselves, our own people, and also the wider culture of this better approach to the Bible. You know, here's a related concern. This is for teachers in this room, maybe teachers who are working not just in religion but other areas. I'm struck again and again on my YouTube forums how people seem to be so ham-handed when it comes to literature. They seem to have very little feel for fiction or for novels or for poetry. There's either journalistic reportage or nonsense. Those are the binary options. I said, do you ever read a poem? Did you ever read a novel to see how these texts convey their meaning? I think it's very important for the next generation of Catholic biblical interpreters to become much more sensitive to poetry, drama, fiction. How does a Shakespearean play mean? It doesn't mean in some journalistic way. How does T.S. Eliot mean in The Wasteland? Trust me, it's not in a journalistic or scientific way. I think part of it, and I'll come back to this, is this sort of scientistic reduction. You know what I mean? That science is everything. Science explains everything. Science can't explain Shakespeare. Science can't explain Dante. Science can't explain A Tale of Two Cities. And the Bible is filled with all kinds of texts from different genres. We've got to be sensitive to that. So, deep trouble about God, deep trouble about biblical interpretation. The third problem, I think, is religion and science. Now, the roots of this problem are very old. They go back to the very dawn of the modern period. You might remember from your philosophy 101 classes, reading the works of Francis Bacon and René Descartes. Descartes said to the intellectuals of Europe, now back in the 17th century, stop worrying about religion. Stop worrying about abstract metaphysics. Rather, he said, turn your intellectual energy to the mastery of nature. Medicine, technology, science, build bridges, build great cities. Stop fussing about all this religious business that no one really knows about and focus your minds on making the world a better place. Francis Bacon said the same thing. He said knowledge is power, and he meant power to dominate nature. I would say, friends, these are among the most followed marching orders in intellectual history. Bacon and Descartes turned from these abstract religious things to the mastery of nature. What happened because of them, and thank God for it? The sciences. The modern physical sciences emerge out of this call to arms. And they've been, we all know this, massively successful. Physics, chemistry, astronomy, et cetera, et cetera. More to it, all those technologies that have attended upon the sciences have benefited us enormously. Look around this room. This room exists because of Bacon and Descartes. The fact that we have lights and we have heat and we have cameras and we have microphones, all that has come from the technologies that were grounded in the sciences. We are in the West especially very attuned to this. We like the sciences. We like technology, and we're right to like them. But what's the problem? The problem is, and I see it every day on these YouTube forums, we tend, therefore, to reduce reality to what the sciences can know. We tend to reduce reality to what our technologies can master and control. Again and again on my forums, I find things like this. Science explains everything. If it doesn't correspond to the scientific method, it's just nonsense. What's the scientific method? Observe, form hypotheses, test them with experiments, and draw conclusions, right? Good method. I like it. Works beautifully in physics, chemistry, astronomy, etc. But what about questions like, is this act good or bad? The scientific method will not answer that question. How about, what makes a state or a city just? I don't care how much you observe, hypothesize, and experiment, you will not resolve that question with a scientific method. Why is that picture beautiful? What makes something beautiful? Try as you might, you will not answer that question scientifically. Or how about, why is there something rather than nothing? Experiment till the cows come home. You will not find an answer to that question. And see, I'm here to tell you, those are not illegitimate questions, though this scientific reductionism wants to tell me they are. No, those are questions of a very deep, rational importance, but they cannot be adjudicated through the sciences. Just as we've lost the feel for literature, poetry, drama, we've also lost the feel, I would say, for philosophy. My boss, Cardinal George in Chicago, who studied philosophy up in Canada, he was over at Laval many years ago. He said the loss of philosophy as a mediating discipline is a great tragedy. Here's what he means. We tend to say religion or science. Binary option. It's religious, nonsense, or science, clear, experimental truth. There's a mediating discipline, philosophy. Every question I've just raised are philosophical questions. We need to tease people back into the beauty and validity of entertaining those questions. I find that all the time. Here's a very good example. Did you see this one? It was about a month ago or so. I did a quick comment on it. Stephen Hawking, who's probably the best known scientist in the world, recently wrote a book, and there was a sort of advance notice about it. And he seemed to argue that the whole universe can just kind of burp itself into being from nothing. Remember that? There's no need for God. The universe can just boop, pop into being from nothing. Well, you know what I found as I was reading that business is it was marked by such a naive philosophical approach. What he meant by nothing was some primordial physical reality. It wasn't nothing in the philosophical sense. It was a lack of clarity philosophically that led to that strange statement of Stephen Hawking. Now, here's another dimension of it, which comes up almost every day on these forums. Lots and lots of people believe that the sciences, these sciences that we love, that we reverence, emerged out of a terrible struggle against religion. From the beginning, religion was there in its obscurantism, in its darkness, fighting the powers of light, and the early scientists had to struggle against religion. Who is brought up constantly in this regard but Galileo, who is the patron saint of this view, right? Saint Galileo that struggled mightily against evil religion. If you go to Rome, in the lovely Campo dei Fiori, it's one of these beautiful public spaces, there's a statue of Giordano Bruno. You know that name? He was a Dominican friar, and he was burned at the stake in the year 1600 at that spot. And Bruno had kind of gone off into sort of pantheistic speculation, and the church at that time condemned him, and they burned him at the stake. And there's this brooding statue of him with his Dominican hood pulled up over his head, and he's a martyr to rationalism and to reason. Well, Bruno and Galileo are always trotted out as the great martyrs, you know. I think that story is ridiculous. think that story has very little justification. It's largely, by the way, an invention of the 19th century, the war of science and religion.